let's start with Florida and Georgia. Number 2, Georgia is a 20. Oh, no, not a 20-point favorite. They're a 16.5-point favorite. Feels like they're a 20-point favorite. Yeah. The over-under I have is a 24-point margin of victory for Georgia. That's where I was going with the 20. That's the average the last 3 years. It is the most lopsided 3-game stretch in this rivalry since Spurrier led Florida to an average margin of victory of 37.7 points from 1994 to 1996.
I tell you what, those Florida streaks of the 90s, buddy, if you had a rivalry with Florida, you would get smoked in the 90s. Even if you were like, I'm not going to speak specifically like Tennessee, but I feel like the entire decade of the 90s, Florida was whooping people. That's how it was for us.
Florida was so good in the 90s, it had to invent new rivalries like an Alabama rivalry in the SEC championship every year.
Yep.
It's kind of, what Georgia's become in a lot of ways, where all of a sudden you're like, oh, Georgia and Alabama, is that a rivalry?
Connor, I'm so glad you just said exactly that, because I was going to ask that question at the end of it, and I'll just ask it here. Florida, Georgia used to be, maybe Tech for a little bit. That deep-seated hatred for Tech, we get that. Auburn for a minute. Is Florida still Georgia's biggest rival, you think?
I think so. I think it's what they take the most satisfaction in, and that's what a rivalry is all about. Mm-hmm. What are the bragging rights that you get to reference most? Because Georgia Auburn's great. It's a great rivalry. I don't know that that's got the same year-round staying power that winning that game in Jacksonville has. Because if you're an Auburn fan, you're like, look at our schedule. We had to face Alabama this year. We had to go to Athens and go to Tuscaloosa. So it gets a little bit muddied, those waters. Whereas this one still feels pure in so many ways. So despite the fact that it is in the midst of this 3-game stretch that's been incredibly lopsided, historically lopsided, I would still say it's on par with that.
Yeah, and the reason why I bring that up is you made exactly that point about Florida, whereas I feel like in the last 3 or 4 years, it's been Alabama. But the deal with Alabama, especially under Saban, is that if you get good enough, you just got to face the final boss, So I'm sure there's a hatred there, but it hasn't exactly really been like a back and forth rivalry with all there's been a couple of crazy finishes for sure, right? But I feel like it doesn't have all the lore yet, whereas like Florida's just kind of like, it's like that rival that you're just like, I hope bad things happen to them. Like, I don't think they're exactly there with Bama yet.
Who's John with each other on social media the most? Yep. Texas and Texas A&M fans, you both get this. You understand what this is like. Who are the people that you love to see hate? Who do you take the most satisfaction in seeing their downfall? That's probably it. So let's go back to those mid-90s games. Earmuff it for just a second, Georgia fans, but it's going to get better for you, I promise. As you recall, that was part of a certain half 100 between the hedges game that Spurrier coached, and that won't be the last reference to that game on this podcast with the 2 guests that we have joining us later. Of course, 2 of the games that were played in that stretch from 94 to 96 were played on college campuses. Very, very unique, obviously. Jacksonville was going through the stadium renovation to welcome the expansion Jaguars. Like, you remember all this stuff. So to find a more lopsided 3-game stretch in this rivalry in which all 3 games were played in Jacksonville, like these last 3 have been, you have to go all the way back to the Harry Truman administration, 1945 to 1947, wherein the Dogs beat Florida by an average of 27 points during that stretch. Yeah. Significant, very significant. This is the most lopsided that it's been for a 3-year stretch in Jacksonville specifically in a very, very long time. You can do the math there. The question is whether or not that'll continue with DJ Lagway in his first start away from the swamp. Will Georgia beat Florida 4 consecutive times for the first time since the Herschel Walker administration? Era. We're not getting political. We're not doing that. I'll say this. Florida's chances look wildly better than they did a month ago. Okay? And that's not just because Lagway kind of gives you a better chance to be able to stretch the field compared to Mertz. That's not just a Lagway versus Mertz thing. I'm going to save a lot of the Lagway talk for our interview later. We get into a lot of Lagway stuff with Doring and Murray, which we did an early drop on the YouTube channel, by the way. If you want to go check that out, you're like, hey, is that going to drop tomorrow? No. We actually dropped that on Tuesday morning. It was that good. Great stuff from those 2 guys. In the 4 games that Florida's played since the A&M loss, since A&M went into the swamp and just ran them out of the building, 3-1 Florida is. All double-digit wins, lone loss, overtime at Tennessee, number 7 team in America. Could have possibly been a different story if Billy had the guts to go for 2 instead of kicking the can into overtime, but you get what I'm saying. You can't undo the bad showings that we saw against Miami and against A&M. Okay, so I'm not taking those away. But in the last month, which is relevant, I don't think there are 25 teams better than Florida. Okay. Maybe that's bold. Maybe that's bold to say that. I feel like I've watched this team pretty closely. Obviously, one of those 25 teams that you would say are 25 teams, maybe that is better than Florida. Georgia, definitely one of them. Okay. They're making any one of those lists.
They're significantly better than Texas, apparently. So
apparently, yeah. Who knows how long the list is of teams that are better than Georgia, but it is not particularly long.
It doesn't include Texas.
Yeah, can't put Texas on it right now. That much we know for sure.
Yeah.
But this Georgia team might actually be getting healthier with Mykel Williams perhaps playing even more snaps than he did against Texas, as well as potentially Tate Ratledge, who dressed against Texas but was unable to give it a go in that one. That's huge because obviously I think Carson Beck needs the interior of that offensive line to hold up. Tate Ratledge in pass protection is where his presence is felt the most. He is considered to be as good of an interior pass protector as there is in the sport. With what Carson Beck likes to be able to do when he is right, you'd think Carson Beck staying clean, operating, working through his progressions, doing all those things instead of rolling out and doing the flushed out of the pocket type throws. He can step up in the pocket better than he can make throws rolling outside of it. I think Ratledge's presence would give him a better chance to be able to stay clean and perhaps take advantage of the fact that I don't think Florida has seen an elite passer since Cam Ward. That's debatable. Okay. Carson Beck has not been an elite passer this year. Okay. Not this year, not with the sample size, even in the Texas game that we have seen from him. His chances of looking like an elite passer increase if Jason Marshall Jr., the top Florida corner, is going to be out and is not going to be one of those lockdown guys on the outside. Again, as I always say, we're doing this before availability reports are out. So by the time people are listening to this, we're probably going to have a little bit more clarity on his status. Maybe Carson Beck doesn't need to be elite to be able to put up points against Florida. But if the last 3 games that Florida has played were any indication, I don't think it's a given that Florida is just a doormat against the run. And I don't think it's a given that you can be one-dimensional against this team. In 3 games in October, Florida was 23rd in FBS with 3.2 yards per rush allowed, which that's all right, really solid. You'll take that. But it's all the more impressive when you consider what Florida was before that. And when you consider that Florida went up against obviously 2 of the top 7 rushing attacks in America with UCF and Tennessee. Does that continue against Trevor Etienne in this reunion game with Florida? I don't necessarily know if it's a revenge game. We'll call it a reunion game. All right. The last time we saw Etienne, he had his best game in a Georgia uniform. He was great. He was as good as you could have hoped for in that game against a really good Texas defense when Georgia didn't have a whole lot else cooking besides him on offense. Georgia hasn't hit 150 rushing yards against FBS competition since that opener against Clemson. And even that was a slow start and it was tough sledding. And they're like, yeah, man, what are we doing with this ground attack early on? And obviously Etienne wasn't out there for that one, but still during this 3-year run against Florida, Dogs hit at least 171 yards rushing in all 3 contests. They averaged 201 on the ground during these last 3 years. Granted, those were against wildly disappointing Florida defenses who were not playing at the level that this group has been playing at the last month. Shout out to Des Watson, our 445-pound thick king of the universe. 18 snaps.
Let me ask you this question, too. Now that we're sitting here looking at Florida's defense, I mean, even like the 2020 trash team did not have a good defense. This is the best Florida's defense has played in
5 years. 5 years.
Comfortably. Since 18?
Yeah. No, since 19.
Since
I would
19.
Say, I would say since 19. That was when Todd Grantham wasn't public enemy number 1.
Mm-hmm.
A little bit of a different story with the Georgia matchup and the struggles that he had there. But, and you know what? He wasn't entirely to blame for that. Their offense struggled in those games against Georgia. But still, yeah, they are playing the best that they've played in a while. All right. And maybe you could maybe compare it to the stretch that they had to start 22. That's probably up there as well, right at the beginning of the Napier era, maybe early on last year. But in terms of like mid-season or later, this is the best that they've looked in a while. And obviously, I think you could point to those guys up front, Cam Jackson as well, the emerging Grayson Howard, a big part of that, what he's been able to do as a young linebacker. Add it all up, and I can absolutely see a scenario in which Georgia finds itself in a dogfight, pun very much intended, against an improving Florida team. That's not going to surprise me because if we're just looking at Georgia, regardless of the opponent, that's kind of been the story, the more times than not, okay? The Texas game is the outlier. Even Georgia fans would tell you that. But I just think that with Georgia getting healthier right now, I think we're going to see a more disciplined team that we saw in the first half of the season. I don't think Georgia goes full Texas mode, but much like when I made a certain prediction that the Dogs would lose by 3 touchdowns, this time I'm going to do the inverse. I'm going to say the Dogs win by 3 touchdowns. Give me Georgia 35, Florida 14.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. I'm trying to look up, man, college stats are so zany, aren't they?
CFBstats.com. That's the best place for stats. If you don't go there, you're missing out. I go to that and I go to Football Reference. Those are the 2 best that give you so many different breakdowns. Like whenever I bring up scrimmage plays of 20 yards or something like that, CFBstats.com is so good. I would advertise for free for them because of the amount of time I've spent on that site over the years.
So I found what I was looking for, which is turnovers forced, right? So in the aggregate over the course of the season, Florida is number 80 with just over about 1 turnover forced a game, right? So we've seen the blueprint, what it looks like whenever Georgia is struggling. It is Carson Beck turnovers pretty clearly, right? In his last couple of games here, he has had 3, 2, 0, 3 picks, right? So all 8 of his picks have come in the last 4 weeks. I think for Florida to be in this game, they need to create some havoc, right? The thing that's been so interesting about Florida is that, what a funny football team. Their defenses, okay, LSU is a great example. LSU turned around their defense. They don't really have a sound defense, as we saw last weekend. They have a havoc-causing, turnover-creating defense. When you have a bad defense, it's a lot easier to get to a place where you're just causing chaos and making negative plays happen than it is to be kind of sound, Florida weirdly has been a sound defense.
I agree.
Doesn't create a ton of turnovers, which is super, because you could have a flash of the pan 4, 5, 6 weeks of creating 2 turnovers a game, and suddenly you flip field position. Doesn't matter. They give it 500, 400 yards. You're not allowing the points. You're scoring points on the other end. You're winning big games. Your defense looks better than they are, right? It's weird because I would say that the one thing that Florida needs to do is something they haven't done. What's up?
I think they've faced relatively low volume passing offenses, which is probably part of it.
Yeah.
UCF not throwing the football a ton. Tennessee obviously has turned into a one-dimensional offense. Kentucky with whatever that was that they put on display last week at the Swamp, not a high-volume offense as well. So you can kind of look at some of that as well with the recent success that they've had and say, all right, is that part of it as well? Just there aren't those opportunities for, as Georgia fans know very well, tips and overthrows. Got to get those.
Yes, exactly. So, yeah, it's super duper interesting, right? Because I would argue that Beck, he's like a volume guy, right? So we've talked about the amount of passing attempts that happen. Beck is another one of those guys that has a ton of passing attempts. He has now gotten to a point in his career where what we liked about him in his first couple of years, he's a veteran backup, he's holding the clipboard, okay, he's coming in, he's running, he's pulling the levers. He's not a game manager, but he's not a game loser, right? Until, SEC championship game, we can talk about that, but that really was kind of a weird play. It wasn't like, he made a bad read and threw it. It was like he fumbled and it was just weird. So it's like this year in these last 4 games, he has tried to do a little bit too much. But I do wonder if Florida can kind of, basically, I'm going to put it to you like this. I think more passing attempts are getting to a point where they're a win for the defense because those picks will happen at any time, and maybe you need to throw some mustard bottles on the field to review them sometimes, but that's, just a bad read at the end of the day. That being said, I think Georgia likely is going to try to shorten the game, right? Again, you're about Florida fans, ETN's pretty hard to tackle. So you get him out in space, you can kind of keep the clock moving, you can do all that. Basically, we don't want the game script, if you're a Georgia fan, that has happened in these kind of weird slugfests, talking about Mississippi State, stuff like that, where it's like, how are we here? They've proven they can throw the 460 yards with Beck. They can throw the ball over the yard. But against Florida, you just kind of want to get out of there. You know what I'm saying? You don't really need to do that. So I would say that this would be a little bit more of like an old school Kirby thing in the way that he's won these games has been make Florida create mistakes, make Florida bobble punts, make Florida put in the wrong guy, make Florida. That's kind of what started to swing last year too, and that was in the middle of the Brock Bowers is hurt. Man, that guy's tearing up in the NFL. Anyway, Brock Bowers is hurt. What's that going to do to Georgia? Well, not much because they're going to still be this juggernaut and not make the mistakes, right? So that's the new thing about Georgia. So yeah, I think that it's going to be a real pre game for Florida's defense. I think that playing well in this game and still losing would be enough hopium. If you're Billy and you get down to the last possession again, it's like, man, if I can just get another year, get Lagway some reps, it's much easier of a sell when you see Lagway playing. Now, but that being said, I just want to say this and I'll get out of here. If that version of Georgia's defense shows up from Texas, Buddy, don't get off the bus.
Lagway, I think Lagway would be very much in over his head. If those Florida tackles don't hold up in this one, you're going to see some things from DJ Lagway that you haven't seen before. And I say that as someone that loves me some DJ Lagway, okay? I am all aboard. I will drive that hype train. But if that Georgia defense shows up, and if they're winning, they won those battles with Kelvin Banks Jr., all right? If they're winning those battles like that and they come out hair on fire, there will be some moments with Lagway where you're like, maybe he just needs to pull an Anthony Richardson to play off right now because you don't know what he's seeing.
That felt mean.
Just saying.
I'm just kidding, but that's actually very funny. But yeah, I think that's the other side of it, right? Is that I trust Georgia's defense. Don't make me regret it. Don't do the Mississippi State thing. But I trust Georgia's defense after the Texas game. You know, if they play 80% of that, if they play 70% of that, if they're just not lazy and bored out there, basically, they're going to force a key turnover or three. Florida's defense has not proven that, and I think Beck is smart enough that in these big games that are not in Tuscaloosa, he takes care of the ball a little bit more. Again, not Texas, but that game was already like I said, it didn't matter. I could have been playing quarterback for Georgia dang near because they should have won that game by 50 points. I mean, literally, so if that defense shows up, it's over with, and I'm going to take Georgia to win by, I think in reality, I'll take Georgia by 2 scores.
If Florida wins this game, I think Billy Napier's back in 2025. I think this is the only game left on Florida's schedule where I would definitively say, yes, he would be back. And I'm even opening up the possibility that they could win this game and lose out, and I still think they probably find a way to run it back with Billy. Because honestly, like if they win this game, the odds of them winning this game and losing out feel so unbelievably unlikely, especially knowing that Florida State's sitting there.
Yeah,
you got that one. Cupcake week is rivalry week for Florida.
You know what? If you beat Georgia and you lose out, you lose to Florida State, you might be in trouble.
You might say that out loud.
They're so bad that you might be right there.
I don't know what those parlay odds are, but they're incredibly high. Yeah, don't even take those. They're not worth it. But if this manifests itself, think of what it would mean. You would knock off a Georgia team with Lagway, your decorated true freshman, your Gatorade National Player of the Year running the show in your offense that you're still calling plays for. Yeah, that would send such a loud message that would be felt well beyond anything Billy Napier's done. Well beyond, you want to talk about Anthony Richardson making some unbelievable plays against Utah in the first game of the Napier era. This would be a much louder statement than that. Florida's got 6 consecutive losses to AP top 25 teams, Will. Last win against a ranked foe in the AP poll came last September in the Tennessee game. Go figure, Trevor Etienne was a star that night, ironically enough. Any guesses on this?
And Watson.
And Desmond Watson. Good point.
Come on now.
Good point.
Here's my star.
God, unreal play on Joe Milton. We need to build a statue for that. We do. Question for you. Let's see if you can name this. When was the last time that Florida beat an AP top 25 team away from the Swamp?
Man, that's a great question because the 3 I thought of were not there. I don't know, actually. Yeah.
2020 against Georgia.
Oh, wow. And that was like the weird game where they had like the Wake Forest quarterback who didn't play, and they had like 8 quarterbacks deep, and then we saw a gentleman we never saw again, and Stetson Bennett couldn't throw the ball.
Wake Forest quarterback? Who are you talking about?
No, remember they started.
You're talking about Jamie Newman?
Yeah, like they were like on their like 5th.
He had already opted out.
No, I know. But like I always think about that game as they were on their 5th or 6th quarterback because they had planned on Jamie Newman.
It had turned into the why isn't JT Daniels playing more? Why has he been sitting for the first? Yeah, that's right.
Also, times.
Yeah. Also, the last game that Georgia has lost to a non-Alabama team that day. Yeah, crazy. Long time ago. Florida has lost 12 consecutive games against AP top 25 teams away from the Swamp. That's not good. And in many ways,
you're going to tell me that since the coronavirus pandemic, Georgia has only lost to Alabama?
After that game.
After that game.
Yeah.
That's insane. I'm sorry. That's a crazy stat. Because
the games
are on big stages, so we feel like,
51 consecutive wins against non-Bama teams is the number. Yeah. Wow. Crazy. 4 years. 4 years that it has been. And in all the wrong ways, the opposite trend for Florida that they're looking to break in what would be a huge, huge way on Saturday. It would just be such a monumental feat for Napier given how we're talking about Georgia right now, too. I mean, it felt so big for Vandy to beat number 1 Alabama, not just Alabama when they've already suffered a loss, they're number 7 or something like that. No, when Alabama was number 1 and coming off the Georgia win, when Georgia's the number 2 team in the country and they're coming off of the bye and the Texas win, it would just send such a loud message to this this narrative that, look, we have echoed since the start of the season, since the Miami game, going back to that Billy Napier's a dead man walking. Well, you get very few opportunities in life to reverse the tide, and this is absolutely one of them. I don't think they do, but again, if it does, we're having significant conversations when we talk again on Sunday.
I've been trying to reverse the tide for like 20 years. It just keeps coming back. Sick of these folks.
That's good.
Anyway,
again, we'll have a lot more with Aaron and CD on this game. So you're getting you're getting what?
So much
50 minutes of breakdown. Yeah, it is Florida Georgia week. Great slate in the SEC though. Besides this game, even though you look at and we're like, hey, we only got 5 games to break down. All of these games have significant implications in terms of SEC championship, in terms of playoff. We've talked about how that's the beauty of this November and the way that it's setting up in the SEC. But this would be an upset. If Florida can pull it off, that would send shockwaves through college football. I hate to even say that. Gosh, bleep that out. I'm going to get Dana to bleep that out. I don't like that I said that.
I'll say this, and I need to say this now because the Georgia game is obviously about to happen. I mean, I think you got to know on Billy before November 23rd, which is when Ole Miss comes to town. Now, I know we all do everything above the board. Nobody will ever do something such as put feelers out to a certain Ole Miss coach while he's in town. But I think you got to know by that date, So that being said, I think a close loss to Georgia, playing it close with these 2 top 5 teams they got. Of the 3, LSU is obviously the most beatable. I don't need to say that for any reason. And so that being said, if you go 1-2, if you go, if you keep the first 2 close, if you don't embarrass yourself by the time Lane Kiffin comes to town, you might be safe, Billy.
Who knows?
Who knows? Surely, yeah.
Wild things can unfold over the course of the next few weeks in Gainesville.